Let me start by asking you a question. Do you think fantasy stories are real? True stories that took place years in the past, finally being penned by talented authors now? Well, most rational people would say no. Of course, fantasy stories full to the brim with magic, ideas of immortality, dragons, and weird trolls aren't real. How preposterous it would be to suggest that they are. And when you look at what makes up a classic fantasy story, the key components of one, The Lord of the Rings has all of it. It's an epic, timeless tale of good versus evil, of massive fire-breathing dragons, immortal, ethereal elves, grotesque goblins, dwarves, talking trees, and food-loving halflings that every Lord of the Rings fan suddenly wants to be. That's probably what comes to your mind when thinking of fantasy as a genre, and The Lord of the Rings too. So why is it that for so many, for myself undoubtedly, does The Lord of the Rings feel real? And maybe this is just me and I'm talking absolute rubbish, but I'm convinced I'm not the only one who feels this way. The Lord of the Rings feels genuinely like a true story that took place many years ago. These characters are Aragorn, the wandering ranger, Legolas, the nimble elf, Gimli, the hearty, meat-loving and bloodthirsty dwarf, Gandalf, the old kooky wizard, Frodo, Sam, Merry, Pippin, the four innocent halflings entrusted with a task far larger and more difficult than any pack of small of theirs should carry. Why do they all feel real? And that's what I want to explore today, why The Lord of the Rings feels real, how Tolkien managed to create this feeling within his tales despite it being such a classic fantasy story. Well, we'll explore all of that in this video, so if you do enjoy and would like to see similar content from me, make sure to please subscribe. This is a growing channel, and honestly one small subscribe click would absolutely help to no end. But now, on with it. So in my opinion, one key facet of this whole debate, one vital key part to the ever-increasing realism of the story, is the absolute sheer depth of The Lord of the Rings, of Middle-earth, that extends far beyond the pages of Tolkien's earliest works. The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were just the beginning, the first pages of an unbelievably large library of lore, history, characters that belong to the Silmarillion, the many histories of Middle-earth volumes, and everything else that Christopher Tolkien and other talented Tolkien experts managed to compile and add to Tolkien's great legendary. The history and mythology is something particularly important because any good story has to have a good background to make the world more enjoyable, make it feel more lived in, more authentic. And while we will get to talking about the history in a minute, I just want to talk about the ties back to Old Norse, Germanic, and even Celtic mythology that plays a crucial part in The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's wider works in Middle-earth. Because this story is littered with them. Across all of Tolkien's books, mythology can be found anywhere and everywhere, influencing him to create an epic story that genuinely feels like it has come out of history and leapt onto the page, essentially crafting a story that was in a way describing our world, mainly Northern Europe and the UK in the ancient times when history was not so concrete for us. When Tolkien constructed this world of his Middle-earth, he presented it in a way that was almost telling a story of our past, of things that transpired in the England of old, using actual historical artifacts by using his knowledge of a language, history, mythology, and so much more to shape Middle-earth and order The Lord of the Rings, and chiefly he shaped, of course, the Silmarillion into almost a history text, detailing stories from different, yet still undoubtedly real, time in history. You see, Tolkien didn't just decide to add different parts of mythology to his story, no. He wanted to create a mythology for England, something that the English could call our own, something that would be part of English history, which he definitely managed to do. Because at the time, it was something that he felt was sorely lacking. All English mythology was usually stolen from other countries, not actually belonging to us, and that was what he sought to change with The Lord of the Rings. And he was able to do that to an extent by also drawing on other myths and tales, most heavily Norse mythology, but also another element or two in there for someone else. And of course, this all helps to the realism of it all, because he was able to draw many things from our real-world history and many other tales of folklore. Anglo-Saxon for the Rohirric, for example. This story was created by someone who had vast knowledge of history, of the old world, and knew not only what he was doing, but what he wanted to do. Put simply, Tolkien was a philologist, extremely well read in subjects such as mythology, history, folklore, and languages, which all quite clearly make their way into his legendarium. And Middle-earth right down to its most fundamental elements, such as the basic map, the most important parts of its history, can be argued to be directly inspired by Norse mythology. In Tolkien's universe, the great Valar live in Valinor. This seems to be inspired by Asgard, as Valinor is connected to Middle-earth by a long straight land bridge similar to the Rainbow Bifrost Bridge that connects Asgard and Midgard, which you may remember from Thor. Another extremely famous example would be Tolkien's elves, a depiction of the fantastical creatures that shape the very idea of elves in fantasy to this day in almost every similar work. So Norse mythology has two different groups of elves called light elves and dark elves. The light elves are described as angelic and magical beings with a supernatural connection to nature, and I think it's pretty clear to see that these creatures inspired Tolkien's elves. And then we have the dark elves, which are possibly, or rather very possibly, the inspiration for Tolkien's dwarves. In Norse mythology, the Dark Elves are said to live underground in caves and workshops, and they are the master blacksmiths of the Norse cosmos. They made many of the great treasures in the Norse universe, including Thor's hammer Mjolnir. As you can already see just from a few simple examples, how it does all link back to Norse mythology, a theory which is spurred on further by Tolkien's unquestionable love for mythology, and how, as I've already explained, this creates an air of ancientness around the Lord of the Rings, that they really did happen, and Tolkien was simply narrating that story. But now moving on to discuss a different aspect of The Lord of the Rings which makes it feel real, even though it isn't, and that is languages and naming in Middle-earth. So alongside Tolkien's excellent use of mythology to enhance his story and his links back to Old English history, there is another key facet to Tolkien's success in creating a lived-in, genuinely realistic world for generations to enjoy. And that is, of course, the languages. Because Tolkien not only included unique Elvish or foreign languages in his works, but actually, astoundingly, made his own languages to further enhance the cultures of Middle-earth and give more life to them, to enhance the history of Middle-earth, allowing for a world you could easily get lost into and believe in for hours, days, weeks, even years on end. So let's talk then a bit about the languages of Tolkien of Middle-earth. In fact, it was one of many things that inspired him for The Lord of the Rings, and it makes his story so real, so enjoyable. He created, of course, the two famous languages that we all know, Quenya and Sindarin, two Elvish languages with their own alphabets, full words and phrases, and everything that a language needs. It is not only a matter that Tolkien created his own languages, but also that he understood how languages change. One such example is that, for example, he introduced loanwords and sound shifts into his own languages in The Lord of the Rings, which is such a fine amount of detail that it is honestly hard not to be in awe at it. Another aspect of Tolkien's writings that seems so small at first but is so hugely important in the grand scheme of things is names. That's right, names. They are so vital to this story for achieving maximum realism, for engrossing you in the story even further. Because one very common occurrence with fantasy writers today, and I'm no professional so I'm not necessarily trying to critique these authors, but all the same, one thing that is so popular today in fantasy is giving characters over the top, difficult to pronounce names to supposedly enhance the whole fantasy medieval aspect of it. Lots of apostrophes, as little vowels as possible, all that jazz. Yet Tolkien crafted his characters, and their names especially, in a way that made them feel like real humans, or real creatures if they were of a different race. For example, Aragorn or Frodo, Sam, Meriadoc, Peregrine, Éomer, Theoden. Such small little details, yet they all add up to make The Lord of the Rings so similar to our own worlds through their names, which sound real. They sound like actual human beings who could have lived in times past. For example, with elves, generally their names follow a certain pattern of having multiple syllables, sometimes sounding quite similar to one another, which then also enhances the feeling of different cultures. And it might seem like such a little thing on the surface, just a name, but in my opinion it is pretty important because Tolkien doesn't, again, overdo the fantasy aspect of it, and whilst it does have all the key facets of a usual fantasy story like the fire-breathing dragons and magic and all that, it still feels like history because the characters are constructed in a way that feels like history. It's not over-the-top fantasy, and that is something that Tolkien does brilliantly. And one letter from Tolkien that talks about this whole naming conundrum in particular is this one, which I'll read out to you. I am sorry the name split his eyes. Personally, I believe, and here believe I am a good judge. They are good, and a large part of the effect. They are coherent and consistent and made upon true related linguistic formula, so they achieve a reality not fully achieved to my feeling by any other name. Inventors, say Swift or Dunsany. and this is from the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. And whilst in other pieces of fiction characters have crazy sounding names, Tolkien does a brilliant job of crafting names that fit for that creature's language, thus making Middle Earth and the characters within it seem much more real for us. And then focusing in a bit more on once again on the languages of Middle Earth make such a profound difference because you can see their marks across order. Places will have names in different languages and they can change over time as well, something I've already mentioned. All things will be called different terms depending on who is speaking because of the language they speak, and once again these finer details are just so helpful. Now let's talk quickly in a small segment about the different cultures of the Lord of the Rings and just how important they are, and how important the way Tolkien crafted them is in the grand scope of things. Because to our world and how our society works in the Lord of the Rings, there are multiple, innumerable amounts of different cultures and types of people. And within the Lord of the Rings, this is the same, much like our world. It creates a sense that Middle Earth isn't too different from us and how we work. And the language and naming aspect, which we just discussed, also does tie into this because each society, race, culture, each different house is so very different, so unique, and naming comes into that. Elves, usually associated with white and blue colours, have a very distinct feel to them. Even the factions within the species are unique like us. For example, the elves of Rivendell, or Wood Elves in Mirkwood, or Galadriel's elves, they're all so different to each other. Their dialect, where they live, their mannerisms, and so much more are unique. It's clear to see the difference between each, which really reflects the way our society works. Each country, each people have their own way of living, different ways of speaking and doing things, and Tolkien's work replicates that brilliantly. To make Middle Earth not just like the setting for an epic journey for a fellowship, or just a world with different landmarks to allow for a fantasy story, but rather the complete opposite, a real world with real people all living in different ways, where an epic fantasy story just happens to take place inside of it. It is very hard to find a fantasy story or world that has as much depth, attention to detail on lore like world building as The Lord of the Rings. That fact is undeniable. Just the sheer depth of Tolkien's history, the detail put into stories within stories within stories in the history of Middle Earth, it is quite simply astonishing. Much like the history of our own world, in fact, in a sense that the entire history of Middle Earth is chronicled. Even the background and lives of certain trees, that's right, trees within massive forests. That is just how deep Tolkien went. And it creates a feeling of undeniability about Middle Earth, if that makes sense to you. It's so detailed, there's so much history that it makes it hard not to believe that Order, Eru, Iluvatar, Middle Earth itself, that it's not real. It has to be. The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit's novels are only a percentage of the full story, which are told in brief detail in tales such as the Silmarillion. There are hundreds of characters with their own story, with full arcs that take place off-page. Each place on the map has a meaning, a detailed backstory. Each race has its own fully developed culture, politics, and subplots within it. There are just so many events that take place outside of the Lord of the Rings, yet in Middle Earth, that feel like they really happened, and are just now being narrated to us, and that in turn lends itself to the increase in realism in the Lord of the Rings, with it feeling like the characters or protagonists are going on a journey in the real world, in a place that has seen many battles, people, and events before them. Without a doubt in my mind, Tolkien is the undisputed king of world building out of all the best authors. And relating back to some stuff I mentioned before, Tolkien first created the language, seeing as he was a linguist, then began work on the actual Middle Earth, starting in the trenches in World War I, detailing some notes for the Silmarillion. He started with the creation of this world, the fundamental aspects of it, such as God and more, being Eru Iluvatar, then much like our world, kept building and building and building onto that until he was able to create a mythos, a story worthy of this world he had fashioned. And maybe some of his locations in Middle Earth felt real because, well, they pretty much are real. For example, the Shire, a picturesque, cozy place containing food-loving halflings. It sounds fantastical, unreal, nonsensical, yet for some reason it's not. It feels like an actual place, or at least it was a place. It carries a feeling of the English countryside, which is something it was inspired by, and thus results in it feeling real. So this is all to say that through a mix of Tolkien's unbelievable world building, use of lore, languages, links to history and mythology, and much more, all contributes to make The Lord of the Rings, even though it's a completely fantasy piece, feel real. And also just a quick mention to the Lord of the Rings movies from Peter Jackson and co, because these films, whilst they are also my favourite most best movies of all time, capture the soul of Tolkien perfectly. Even though the legendary author himself had nothing to do with the creation of the films, they capture the heart and soul of Tolkien somehow. And unlike many modern movies and shows set in a similar fantasy world that manage to replicate the source material, and whilst it doesn't follow the Lord of the Rings books to achieve, the Lord of the Rings does do it. It does manage to replicate the source material and be faithful to the book. It manages to give off the same feeling that you feel when reading Tolkien's work. The amount of extra work they put in to achieve this is nothing short of astonishing, and allow us to visualize Tolkien's world even better, and add to the idea that somewhere, sometime, the Lord of the Rings was a real. So then that is the end of today's video. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. If you didn't manage to get all the way here, make sure to comment down below what you think of why you love the Lord of the Rings so much, what you thought of this video, and if you want to add anything on to why it feels so real, add to my argument, make sure to do so, please. Also, please subscribe. This is a growing channel, and one simple click would hugely help. But anyways, that is the end of today's video. Thanks for watching. Dot Sauron out.